The cemetery was quiet. Too quiet. A winter wind drifted through the leafless trees, whispering through rows of old stone, brushing past flowers long wilted and names half erased by time. At the foot of one modest grave knelt a boy, no older than 6, his cheeks pink from the cold, his tiny hands wrapped around a broken wooden toy car. His coat was slightly oversized, his shoes worn. He said nothing, just gently placed the toy on the grave like it belonged there. A few feet away stood a man in a sleek black overcoat, his hair silvered, his shoes polished, his posture rigid. His name was Leonard Grant, a billionaire known for power, not presence. But today he was neither. Today he was confused, and something in that toy, in that boy, made his chest tighten. The boy glanced up, eyes innocent, voice soft. He said I could come play with him here. Leonard's breath caught. That toy. It was the exact model his son once held close, but his son had been gone for a year. So who was this child? And how did he know? Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, stay with us, because this one, it'll leave a mark. Leonard Grant stood at the edge of the cemetery path, his breath slow and visible in the cold afternoon air. Frost clung to the edges of every gravestone like nature's way of reminding the living that time was always moving, even when grief wasn't. The sky was dull, a muted gray that mirrored the stillness inside him. It had been a year since he last came here, a year since Henry's funeral. His only son, his only real tether to anything outside of business meetings, quarterly earnings, and press conferences. Since the accident, Leonard hadn't stepped near this place. He had buried his grief the same way he buried his past, under marble, money, and silence. Yet today, something brought him back. And it wasn't peace. It was confusion. Because kneeling at Henry's grave was a child, a boy no older than 6. The boy wore a puffy blue jacket, clearly second-hand and too big in the sleeves. His cheeks were red from cold, and he had no gloves. In his small hands he held a wooden toy car, chipped and missing a wheel. But his posture was steady, reverent. He wasn't playing. He was remembering. Or grieving. Or maybe both. Leonard didn't speak. He didn't even move closer. Something about the boy's presence made him feel like an intruder. The wind picked up, stirring a few brown leaves around the stone. He noticed how the boy sat, legs folded beneath him, back slightly, hunched, head tilted in the same way Henry used to tilt his when he was deep in thought, before the world demanded that he grow up. There was something painfully familiar in the way the boy existed in that moment, like a quiet echo of a life Leonard once knew but hadn't fully appreciated. The grave itself was modest. No granite angels, no gold plaques. Just a simple stone. Henry's name carved into it, along with 2 dates that felt too close together. Leonard had made it plain on purpose. No amount of money could disguise what he had lost, and in his mind, anything more would have felt like a bribe for forgiveness. He didn't deserve. Still, he didn't speak. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It felt purposeful, like the air between them was holding something sacred. He watched as the boy ran a small finger along the name on the stone, then gently placed the toy car beside it. Leonard's chest tightened. That car, Henry had one just like it. It had been broken the same way, too. This wasn't a random visit. This wasn't coincidence. And for the first time in months, Leonard felt something stir beneath the icy shell he'd wrapped around his grief. Not fear, not guilt, just the beginning of a question. Leonard finally stepped forward, his shoes crunching softly on the frostbitten grass. The boy didn't turn around. He remained crouched beside the grave, staring at the small toy car as though it held a story he couldn't quite finish. The silence between them was still thick, but Leonard broke it with a voice that sounded more like a breath than a command. "Why are you here?" he asked, his tone flat but edged with something unsettled. The boy looked up, unbothered by the man's sharp suit or cold eyes. "He told me I could come back," he said simply. Leonard's brow furrowed. "Who told you?" "The boy with the nice laugh," Sammy replied. "He was sad, but he played with me." The words hung in the air, each one soft but sharp enough to prick the space between disbelief and fear. Leonard's spine straightened. Henry had died at this very grave, in a freak accident after running from the car. He had wanted to bring flowers, his final act of defiance and love. No one else had been buried nearby since. No other children. No visitors. The groundskeeper had confirmed that weeks ago when Leonard considered putting up a bench in his son's memory. "Played with you?" Leonard asked, his voice growing taut. Sammy nodded, unfazed by the man's growing unease. "He had brown shoes. He laughed funny, like it got stuck in his throat. We talked about trees and the broken angel statue." Leonard's breath caught. The broken angel, half its wing chipped, was hidden behind a thick line of hedges. No visitor would notice it. Only someone who had spent time here. Only someone like Henry, who used to pretend it was a guardian protecting the small graves on cloudy days. And he said this was his favorite. "Car," Sammy added, nudging the wooden toy with a gloved finger. "But he didn't fix the wheel. He said it was supposed to stay broken, like time stopped with it." Leonard's heart thudded in his chest. That phrase, "like time stopped with it," was something Henry had once said at dinner when his grandfather passed away. He was only 10, trying to understand loss. Leonard had barely noticed it then. Now the memory sliced through him. He stared at the boy. "What's your name?" "Sammy," the boy said. "Where do you live, Sammy?" Leonard asked, stepping closer, crouching now, trying to catch the boy's eyes. "Near the bus stop," Sammy answered, eyes still on the grave. "The one with the long bench, and the dog that never barks." Leonard blinked slowly. That bus stop was almost 5 miles away, across town, in a rundown part of the city he hadn't visited in years. The bench was famous among locals for its chipped green paint and the old mute dog that sat under it every afternoon like a statue. Henry had once asked to take a picture with that dog years ago on a drive with his nanny. This wasn't a coincidence. The boy's words weren't rehearsed. They weren't twisted stories fed by someone with cruel intentions. They were too natural, too childlike, too real. And suddenly, Leonard felt the cold in his bones shift into something else, something deeper than confusion, something like fate curling its fingers around him. Leonard didn't fully understand why he offered the boy a ride, or why his hand instinctively reached out as Sammy stood beside the grave. There was no plan, no calculation, just an undeniable pull, like he was following a thread he hadn't known he'd been holding. Sammy climbed quietly into the back seat of the sleek black sedan, the wooden car still clutched tightly in his hands, They drove in silence, past the polished buildings Leonard owned, beyond the gated neighborhoods he'd helped design. With every mile, the surroundings shifted. Paint peeled from doorways, roofs sagged, sidewalks cracked. They turned down Endi Noinachi, narrow street where the houses sat too close and the windows stared out like tired eyes. Sammy pointed. "That one," he said. Leonard parked outside a crooked two-story home that looked barely able to hold itself upright. The porch railing was splintered. A trash bag had frozen to the steps. Leonard followed the boy inside, ducking slightly through the warped doorway. The air was cold, heavy. No heat, no lights. Just the quiet wheeze of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. The kitchen smelled like dust and thyme, and the only sign of life came from a dim bedroom where a frail woman lay beneath a mountain of mismatched blankets. "That's my mom," Sammy whispered. Leonard's chest tightened. The woman stirred at the sound of his voice and slowly opened her eyes, confusion swimming through her expression before recognition set in. Not of Leonard, but of the world around her. Her voice was dry when she spoke. "Sammy, you're okay?" she murmured. "I brought someone," he replied. Leonard looked around the room. Bare walls, a flickering candle, a drawing taped to a dresser. He stepped closer. It was a child's sketch, done in crayon. Two boys stood holding hands. One had a glowing halo above his head and wings stretching out behind him. The other looked just like Sammy. "He's been drawing him," she said quietly, her eyes fluttering open again. "Talking about him for weeks now. A boy named Henry. I thought it was just an imaginary friend." Leonard reached out and touched the drawing, his hand trembling. He hadn't cried when Henry died, not when the casket lowered, not when he packed away his son's room. But now, in this room that smelled like cold metal and distant hope, the grief cracked through. He turned to Sammy, voice rough. "Why did you go to the grave, Sammy? Who told you to take the car?" The boy looked up at him with eyes too clear for his age. "He came in my dreams," he said softly. "He said if I bring the car, you'd know I was real." Leonard stumbled back a step. His breath hitched. This wasn't about coincidence. It wasn't a child's imagination. It was something more. Grief folding in on itself, reaching out from places logic couldn't touch. Maybe Henry had found a way to say what Leonard never let him. Tears spilled down Leonard's face, hot and unfamiliar. His voice cracked. He never said goodbye. Sammy stepped closer, reaching out with one small hand to rest on Leonard's. "He did," he said gently. "Through me." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. But they split something open inside the man who had built empires to avoid feeling pain. In that moment, kneeling on a worn floor beside a child with nothing but a toy car and a message from somewhere beyond, Leonard broke. Not from weakness, but from finally letting go. The house was still as Leonard sat in the corner of the room, Sammy curled up beside him, the dim light casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. His eyes lingered on the drawing again, then shifted to the wooden car Sammy still held, its wheel dangling by a thin sliver of glue that had long since given up. And in the silence, Leonard's mind began to drift, backward, painfully, inevitably. He remembered Henry's final days with an ache that felt freshly sharp. The boy had grown quieter, more withdrawn. Leonard had noticed, but chose not to ask. His calendar was full, his phone never stopped ringing, and he'd convinced himself that Giving his son space was the same as giving him love. But space can stretch into distance, and distance into silence. Their last conversation came flooding back, hurried, dismissive. Henry had wanted to skip a prep meeting for a school interview. Leonard, impatient, had told him not to waste time, dreaming when he already had a path. "You'll thank me later," he'd said, shutting the door behind him. Later never came. Back in the present, Sammy stirred beside him and opened his small hand. The toy car rested in his palm again, chipped, worn, but carried with such care it might as well have been made of gold. "He told me to give this to you," Sammy whispered. "Said he didn't finish fixing the wheel." Leonard took the toy slowly, his fingers trembling. He turned it over and stared at the exact spot where the axle was crooked. Henry had once begged him to fix the same flaw in his own wooden car. Leonard had promised he would. He never did. Looking at the boy now, so gentle, so sure, Leonard understood. This wasn't a haunting. It wasn't about ghosts. It was about grace. Henry hadn't come to reopen wounds. He had come to mend them. Leonard's voice cracked as he spoke, barely more than a whisper. "What if he sent you? Not just to say goodbye," he said slowly, "but to remind me how to live?" Sammy looked at him with eyes far too wise for, 6 years old, and nodded. "He said you were sad, but not broken." The toy rested between them like a bridge, unfinished, imperfect, and yet enough. Leonard reached out, not with grandeur, but with trembling sincerity, and pulled the boy into his arms. He didn't hug him out of pity or charity. He hugged him because something inside him recognized something eternal inside Sammy, something that had been buried with his son, but had found its way back in the quiet warmth of a stranger. The weight in Leonard's chest didn't vanish, but it shifted. It no longer dragged him down. It reminded him he was still alive. In the weeks that followed, Leonard moved quietly but with purpose. There were no headlines, no press releases, no grand announcements, only action. The first thing he did was settle every one of Sammy's mother's medical bills. Then came the repairs to their home, followed by discreet relocation to a modest but safe house closer to town, with warmth in the walls and sunlight that actually reached the floor. He didn't do it out of guilt. He did it because he could, and for the first time in his life, that was reason enough. But even more than financial, support. Leonard offered something rarer: presence. Every Friday afternoon without fail, he visited. No suits, no staff, just him. Sometimes he'd bring Sammy books, other times they'd go walking near the lake. He never brought up Henry. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. As weeks turned into months, Leonard channeled his energy into something lasting. He founded a program in Henry's name, The Silent Ones. It was created for children like Sammy, kids navigating grief and silence, those who had things to say but no one who truly listened. Through storytelling, art, and community spaces, the initiative connected grieving children with mentors, counselors, and friends. It wasn't about fixing broken lives. It was about creating bridges between the lost and the living, between memory and meaning. Sammy quickly became the soul of the project, not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of what healing could look like. His drawings, once scribbled on the back of receipts, were now part of classroom walls and therapy centers. In every interview, Leonard insisted Sammy wasn't the boy who got rescued. He was the boy who reminded the rest of them what mattered. The cemetery transformed too. Leonard funded the planting of seasonal flowers, added benches beneath the old trees, and repaired the chipped angel statue behind Henry's grave. The coldness of that place softened. It became less of a tomb and more of a quiet sanctuary. At Henry's headstone, a new plaque was placed, small and simple. Sometimes angels don't whisper. They send someone small to speak for them. On the anniversary of Henry's death, Leonard returned with Sammy. It was different this time. No weight in his chest, no storm in his head, just stillness. Sammy ran ahead, laughing, a sound Leonard hadn't realized he missed until it returned. The boy stopped at the grave and sat cross-legged, pulling something from his backpack. The toy car, fully repaired, the wheel restored, its paint gently touched up, gleamed in the soft sun. Leonard approached, kneeling beside him. "You fixed the wheel," he said softly, eyes resting on the small object that once meant everything. Sammy grinned and looked up. "We both did." And in that moment, Leonard understood. The car wasn't the only thing mended. The silence that had once defined his life was now filled with something else. Not noise, but connection. Not answers, but understanding. He didn't need to speak to know that Henry would have smiled at the sight. He didn't need to ask why, or how, or what it all meant. Some stories don't need words. Some goodbyes come wrapped in small hands and broken toys. And sometimes the best kind of redemption arrives not in time, but in love, rebuilt piece by piece. Sheer silence surrounded them, but it was no longer empty. It was full of memory, of healing, of meaning, the kind of silence that doesn't ache but hums gently with peace. A man who once owned everything the world could offer, wealth, power, status, had finally found the one thing that had always eluded him: connection. And he found it in the smallest hands and the softest voice, through a boy who carried a broken toy and a message from somewhere beyond understanding. Leonard no longer needed Henry to say goodbye, because he finally heard what had always been there. "He never said goodbye," Leonard whispered to himself. "He just left a message in the heart of a boy who knew how to listen." Have you ever received a sign when you needed it most? Not a loud miracle, not a grand moment, but a quiet signal that healing was still possible? Sometimes it doesn't come from understanding. It comes from being still, from listening, from letting someone else carry the goodbye you were too broken to speak. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who's still searching for peace. And don't forget to subscribe, because the most powerful stories don't always begin with noise. They begin in silence. Until next time, believe in second chances, even when they come in ways you never expected.